Great. Okay, so we're just going to dive in to basically situating our educational advocacy and monitoring within a human rights framework. And I know you all have been joining us over the past few weeks, so we've had a couple of conversations around our statewide work related to school policing and how we move in solidarity with our partners from DSC California. And the other kind of portion of work that we've been doing in some of the breakout rooms is talking about human rights monitoring, talking about implementation, especially talking about what's going on in our schools this year with COVID-19 and emergency schooling and distance learning, and how we can be most effective in supporting monitoring across the state. So I'm gonna just turn it over to Carl to share his thoughts with us.
So today, my portion is really a shortened version of a larger presentation that Dignity in School California have been doing. It's largely a result of the work that we've done in the Central Valley Movement Building, where we look at the history of education, where it has been, how it has evolved from religious common schools, public schools, and industrial schools to post-industrial to the informational age, and how it impacts our students, and most particularly our students of color. My piece is principally taking a look at the educational system today, how it functioned. And I wanted to do that today as part of the of helping to set up and frame the question around human rights and using a human rights framework, because oftentimes the discussion around using a human rights framework is oftentimes spoken and addressed in a more abstract, esoteric, and even to a certain extent, a way of imagining what that means in terms of the impact, but it's not necessarily grounded in the question of reality. And we wanted to do that with education. So what I wanted to do was, what does the educational system look like next? So we have to understand what the role of the educational system in our current racial capitalism. And I won't have time to go into what's racial capitalism. I'm just proud of the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly those in Chicago, has really returned the notion of what racial capitalism is, and what it's an important impact on policing today. But I want to speak about it in terms of the role of the educational system plays in the current racial capitalism. And it's principally served as a social reproductive process for racial capitalism. So don't get me wrong, education in a sense for our people has oftentimes have a dual role. It has a role of both being the most oppressive and also liberating. And what I mean by liberating, it has been a way of how we can improve our current conditions and status and moving up into the middle class, or what, and be able to have resources to survive in our current society, and the power of knowledge in of itself. But the educational system was never really designed to do that. It was designed merely to reproduce this system of racial capitalism. Next. So fundamentally, the educational system acts as more of a sorting process, and it has three principal processes. One is in terms of outcome, in terms of why do we have the school to prison pipeline. And I'm only going to speak to the question of the school to prison pipeline, but I'm also going to speak to some of the other aspects that are related to that. One is social control, channeling, testing, and tracking. Next. So let's start with testing. So the most often typical approach is the IQ test, standardized test, ACT college exam, but all of them are generally culturally and racially biased, and they all produce a certain particular outcome. So what is the history of tests in of itself? Next. The entire educational system sits on a structure of tests and sorting that was invented by the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement emerged at the turn of the century, 1900, as a way to what they call scientifically use science to racially justify racism, and by testing who was smart and who wasn't smart. They used it in a lot of cases, looking at skull sizes, looking at hand, all kinds of other things. So there's a whole movement, and Sacramento was one of the communities that had a significant number of folks who were part of the eugenics movement. A lot of their names are now identified with different schools and streets in Sacramento. But there was that whole movement around justification and using science as a basis of justification of racism and racial insubordination. Next. One of the psychologists, Carl Brigham, wrote that African Americans were on the low end of the racial, ethnic, and cultural spectrum. Brigham had helped to develop the aptitude test for the U.S. Army during World War I and was influential in the development of the SAT. So most people think of the SAT as the most objective system. It was never designed to be an objective testing system. It was specifically designed to serve as a racially biased and culturally biased system. And this is a result from at the turn of the century, where it showed, and again, this is 1900, so or not close to 1900, right around the war, 1914 war, but World War I. It shows Southern African American, and then above that is Poland, Belgium, Italy, Greece, Russian, what we would call the Slavic countries, which were new immigrants that were coming in at the time. And at the very top is the commission officers, which is a really interesting. This is a test that the eugenics movement had designed. Next. The other approach to the educational sorting process is called channeling. All of us had at some form of school guidance counselor. We've had, and a school guidance counselor oftentimes would determine what your outcome was going to be, whether you would be going to college, if they would provide you the information as to how to get into college, or a career, what they call career technical institute, or the military. When I was in high school, my counselor never provided me information about college, how to apply to college, how to get the recommendation was some form of career institute. And many of us, because it was at the time of the Vietnam War, was often recommended to go into the military. So a lot of this, the guidance counselor determines your outcome by either providing you information or withholding information in terms of what where your outcome is going to be. Next. So also the social control piece, and the social control piece in the educational outcome is an interaction and use of race and class. And they use a number of these, and in this particular case, suspension, expulsion, and AP class. And I want to speak to the AP class because oftentimes, I'm not going to go into it a lot of detail, but AP classes, we used to, for those who've been around the education system for a long time, used to be called the tracking system. So for those who didn't do well, they took remedial courses and took the same course over and over again. And those who did well went on tracked into more advanced classes. And at the time, it wasn't called advanced placement classes. Today, this is a new form of a tracking system that's determine who's going to do well, who's going to be more in the advanced placement classes, which means you're going to go to college track, and the other ones that are not going to do well because we can't control you, socially control you. You're going to go in the expulsion and the suspension process. Next. So racial and class socialization process is oftentimes and it oftentimes is actually, in all actuality, is conducted in the classroom. Next. How does that work? This is a typical example that I use from Purcell's book, but it shows you that what we today call implicit bias. If a teacher, middle-class teacher who comes from a particular racial and class structure has a certain ideology, which is called middle-class education. And in a middle-class education, there's a certain ideological concept of what education is supposed to mean. It means that you come, all your classmates are all white, all your classmates or most of your classmates are come prepared. They sit in the classroom. They are not disruptive. They all have a certain expectation in terms of where they're going to end up in testing and how they are tracked. All their peers who they socialize is all white middle class kids. They all have the expectation that they're all going to college, and they have a certain perspective of how everybody's supposed to act. They're good students, they act well, they test high on test scores, and so that's their experience in the middle class white middle class educational process, and therefore that's what the teacher expecting of their students. But next slide. We all know most white middle class teachers, not most, but many end up in our urban schools where most of our students are mostly Black and brown. And when they have this certain expectation, they have a certain way of looking at their students, certain way of pedagogy of education, and that they practice some form of tracking or curriculum differences, which is differentiating students of how they are taught. So if you're just not doing well, we'll put you in repeat, do memorization kind of thing. They're also, in terms of how they interact with the students, in terms of, I like this student, I'm gonna give you a warm and positive approval process. Hey, Johnny did well, but LaShanya didn't do so well, and I just don't want to deal with her. Visual clues. I look at certain students who I perceive as doing well, and the other ones that sit in the back, I'm not even interested. I won't, see them even though they may raise their hand. And it is also, it happens in terms of just feedback, differential activities, in terms of homework, tone, wait time. That's pretty common, where if you're perceived as a student from a certain social and racial class, your wait time and response is going to be quicker versus those who are not. As a result, the educational outcome impacts the cognitive and non-cognitive way, and self-esteem and confidence and interest of the student, which reinforce the teacher's expectation that all my Black and brown students are not like my white middle class students, and therefore they're not deserving of the kinds of quality of education. Next. So, as a result, what does that happen? So in The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter C. Woodson would often say in the book, it said, if you can control a man thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, oops, moving ahead.
Sorry.
Outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there's no back door, his very nature will demand one. That's what the racial socialization process does. You don't have to tell anyone that they're going to be, be disrupted. That you create the condition upon which they become disruptive. Next. The other, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but what we call the Eurocentric learning. Remember, much of the educational system was created for immigrants at the turn of the century. They use the industrialization model. That's where you hear the bell the bell came from the factory bell. Getting in straight lines, that's when you go into the factory. You go line up and go to your factory floor. Also, the educational system is European focused in terms of study. All good education in terms of literature, science, and math is from a European model. The other is a banking model, which is simply, Pablo Freire talks about where you assume your students are deficit, and all your task is just to fill their head with knowledge, because most of them don't know anything to begin with. They're all ignorant and stupid, so we could just provide them information. So a lot of that's what the other is ability grouping process, and then lastly is the school push out, and that's where we're most familiar with in terms of suspending, disproportionately suspending and expelling students of color. Next. So the educational outcome, the school to prison pipeline, that's particularly with this, you create a racial socialization process coupled with the whole suspension and expulsion process, automatically creates a system where students that would do well ultimately end into the prison industrial complex. Next. So this is the outcome that I tell everyone in terms of how it reproduces the racial capitalism process. You can either, if you're suspend and expel, you end up in the prison and underground economy. If you do well in school and you get a college education, you may become a manager of business or government. Or you may become a professional technical worker. And then if you're just an average student, barely made it just out of high school, you end up in the lower sector of the working class. This is the outcome of which this is created. And then next. This is capitalism. As you can see, at the very top is the wealthy, and the wealthy produce the wealth. The educational system, as you can see here on the far right, produces those students who ultimately will work in the service sector, maybe in the technical sector, and those who do not make it at the very bottom, end up in prison. This is where we're over police. We have the check cashing. We have all that exists in society to reinforce the vast majority of us at the bottom, and only the very few make it to the top. So, what thoughts come up as we talk about the role of education system and racial education?
Thank you so much for that portion, Carl. As we pause, I just want to elevate, if folks want to share some of the good discussion that was happening in the chat as well. So what thoughts are coming up for you as we talk about this portion of the presentation?
This is Deborah. This was powerful. This was incredibly powerful, Carl. Thank you so much. Centering eugenics is something that most people never do. And the fact that you just named it is really powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Also, that Carter G. Woodson quote is one of my favorite. that is one of my favorite quotes of all. You just nailed it. Even know how many people are familiar with that quote. Mm-hmm. In the Black community, in education in particular, that's a quote we use all the time. So thank you.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
Well, this is Ruth. Folks may have heard about this intermediate, I don't even know what to call it, but the end of UC is using the SAT and ACT, and I'm thinking of some pieces I read earlier in the summer about how And I'll be happy for Chris to respond because I know EJS was a part of the work. So I don't mean that it's not worthwhile to take down these pieces that you're talking about, Carl, but I'm thinking about how much of the legal victories to confront our American education system still want, like, confirm a narrative of its worth versus, you know, confront all these pillars you're talking about. So I'm interested if other people are having reflections about the way traditional legal approaches in the narrative around those victories that are tiny, tiny pieces of the work, you know, reinforce a different framework.
I love that, Ruth. That's where we're going, for sure, with the next couple of slides. Do folks have thoughts? Or reflections based on what Ruth shared?
Sorry, can you rephrase your question, Ruth?
Okay, I mean, maybe what I should be doing, Chris, is I'm guessing the way EJS is going to frame what happened with this preliminary injunction on the SAT and ACT might be differently than what I just read from public counsel. So first, I'll just say that, you know, the way that when a piece of this testing scheme is taken down, it's like these racist tests are blocking admission, and like the removal of that gets at some of these core pieces and how much the narrative around legal victories seems to me to sometimes that narrative does a disservice to all that Carl's talking about, what Deborah lifted up, anchoring everyone in the fundamental project that is the American education system, rather than, you know, there are these ills, these things that we just have to fix or something. So I don't know if that makes more sense now, Chris.
I don't know that I followed you during all of that. It's been a long week already, so I apologize in advance. But I think both are present. So everything that Carl talked about, I certainly have spoken on often and experienced personally. And thinking about our victory with this SAT, ACT stuff, the significance of being in that space and working with folks and being able to provide voices that generally aren't there was also critical, even for the folks who are on this side, or quote unquote the winning side of this litigation effort. So I think all of these roles are being played that are critical for trying to transform and redress some of the harm that folks have been experiencing through systemic oppression and racism in the education system for some time now.
Ruth, just and Chris, in parallel to that, we definitely in teacher education, and not from the legal standpoint, but definitely in the teacher preparation pipeline, a significant increase in applicants to teacher education that normally would have been kept out of the profession due to testing like CBEST, CSET, a lot of those entrance requirements. So definitely an opportunity for those that have maybe been kept out. But again, seeing lots of parallels with that aspect of it.
And this is Samantha, and I'm sorry, I cut out a little bit during one part of the conversation, so I had to redial in, but I wanted to echo Deborah's sentiment, and thank you, Carl, for the framing. I think it's absolutely grounded in you know, what we're coming to understand much more explicitly, and how we need to think about our work and drive the work. I think, and this kind of picks up on the SAT question. I know one of the things that we struggle with around, and by we, I'm using like Children Now and some of the different statewide partners, when it comes to assessment issues, is that it's often the way at a systemic level you can see where kids are not getting support and opportunities, right? Like it allows you to say, wow, this school is really not stepping up for kids. And so often it's framed as about the students, which is absolutely the wrong approach. It needs to be framed around the opportunities that are provided and the supports that are provided, but the assessments are a flashlight to be able to identify where these systemic challenges. And so I just wonder how you think about reconciling that tension there of making sure that we are still doing the work to identify where schools and districts aren't stepping up for kids, especially when we have such limited tools, and assessments are one of those tools.
One of the things that I think, and I know Angela's going to cover some of these pieces, but the purpose of giving context to the current educational system in America and a little bit about the history is that there's a number of things that are emerging, and COVID is actually what some people describe as the shock therapy of where we're headed. And what does that mean in the informational age of the kind of education that we want to see for our kids? And it speaks to the question of human rights, but we have to be both cognizant of the current